Given that Boone is in the mountains, there have been a lot of flooding disasters here, especially in the whole of Watauga County and in western North Carolina. So in this video, I'm going to go through the history of flooding specifically and kind of other natural disasters. But the two big things are the 1940 flood and the 2024 flood, which was Hurricane Helene. So that's what I'm mainly going to cover in this part of the series. Boone, North Carolina. A small city nestled in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, home to Appalachian State University. My name is Fabiano, and in this series, I'm taking a look through the history to see how Boone formed and where it's going. From what I've seen, before the 1940 flood, there was two big floods that happened in western North Carolina, and big being, respectively to their time. One occurred in 1877. This first one, there's not a lot that is known about it, specifically for the town of Boone. Again, Boone was created in 1872, so this was only like 5 years after. Not a lot of people lived here. Not a lot of records were kept. But in Asheville, it was said that this had a lot of damage and that the French Broad River surged about 23 feet. And then the second of these floods was the 1916 flood. So this one definitely had more of an impact on Boone that was recorded. The rivers surged all through Watauga County and the western part of the state, and about 80 people were confirmed to have died throughout all of western North Carolina. And this definitely includes Asheville. So 80 people from Boone did not die, because the town of Boone probably only had around like 300 to 400 people at that time anyway. During my research, I found a book called A Disastrous Flood by Ivory C. Greene. Now, her story takes place in Deep Gap, North Carolina, but that is pretty much right next to Boone, and all the experiences are going to be very, very similar. This book was made in 1941 because it was about the 1940 flood, but in the book, she actually mentions her experience with this 1916 flood. This flood in 1916 occurred on July 14th, 1916, and she wrote that in her experiences, she was working as a school teacher in Ashe County. She came home to Watauga County, where Deep Gap is, to visit her family, and her mother, and her sisters were looking outside, and they could see all of the black and the muddy water rising up, and eventually it barricaded them into their house, and she couldn't leave her home for about a week. Here's a quote directly from the book. The 1916 flood tore up many roads, including the Blowing Rock Turnpike. Most of the roads then were just dirt or gravel, and it didn't take much rain, floods, and landslides to wash them away. Many crops were damaged, but very few houses were wrecked. Nothing compared with the 1940 flood. August 13th, 1940 was the date that the worst flooding disaster up to that point had occurred. Around 13 inches of rainfall fell in just 3 days in Boone, causing about 2,000 landslides. Now, I don't know exactly how that number is calculated, whether it's a tiny little slide or they factor in massive landslides, but again, a lot of hills, a lot of rocks, and a lot of slippy slopes, causing a lot of trees to overturn, just like we saw with Hurricane Helene. A lot of damage can be done when there's too much water. And this disaster caused 16 people, specifically in Boone, North Carolina, to lose their lives. Here's some quotes I have from that same book. First, it was a sad and exciting time in northwestern North Carolina. On the night of August 13th, 1940, when the disastrous flood came, again, that's the title of the book, sweeping away homes and taking lives in its raging torrent. Now, I believe that the author said it was exciting because back then there was not a lot going on. I mean, there was a world war, but specifically living in Boone, having a flood was like the exciting occurrence, I guess, but I don't think they knew just how devastating the flood would be. The author said that it was pretty much raining the entire week beforehand, but then on the night of the flood, about 5 p.m., the rain really, really ticked up. And then throughout the book, I'm going to mention the stories of her family, but she basically said that the bulk of the flooding was done overnight. Basically everyone, if they didn't know about it, they were asleep. A lot of damage came, and then in the morning they were basically either flooded in or much worse. The author says that the hillsides and steep mountain slopes were already saturated by the long continued rains. Great masses of earth, together with uprooted green trees, logs, and huge stones, were torn from their age-old moorings with rending noises awful to hear. As they proceeded, still gathering millions of tons of water, stones, and other rubbish, they swept a pathway clear down to bedrock, depositing at intervals heaps of huge stones, uprooted trees, and shattered buildings. Both the Yadkin and the Watauga rivers rose to 6 feet higher than the previously max recorded height, which occurred in the 1916 flood. The main experience I'm going to present is the story of Andrew Greene and his family. He's related distantly to Ivory Greene, who's the author of this book, and he had him, his wife, 6 children, and then a good amount of farm animals, and their farm/house in Deep Gap, North Carolina. The night of August 13th, 1940, when that flood came, the book says that a few chickens, a cow, and some hogs died from the floods, and that it came really heavy around 9 p.m., eventually causing their house to flip upside down. Their house tumbled around 3 full rotations until it got destroyed into pieces. And this was around 9 p.m. and it killed Andrew and 3 of his daughters. The other 4 members of the family eventually did survive. However, their tales are a lot more complicated than just that. First, the mother and Hopper were both awake and with the family at the time of the flood, and they both miraculously survived the house overturning and escaped the rubble. And then BL, who was the youngest, he's 7 years old, he was asleep and his body just somehow miraculously got saved. And then the last person is Earl. He just wasn't home that day. The first person to escape the house was Hooper. I know I've been pronouncing it Hopper. In the book and in my notes, it is spelled both ways, so I don't know. But he escaped the house as it was turning. He gets caught in a bush on the side of the stream, you know, because it was a massive raging current from the flood. So he basically gets out of that, gets caught in a bush, and he's staying in the bush and he's trying to climb up to safety. And then he hears one of his sisters, Velma Lou, calling out and screaming from inside the house. And he tried to go save her. He tried to go, once the house was in pieces, to go in and find her. He couldn't find her, and he couldn't find her body at all. And then for him specifically, he really only had a slight bruises all over his head and body. And then that's basically it. He graduated from high school just the year before. He was 19 years old. So he was in pretty good shape given all of that just happened. So Velma and Hooper were basically around the same area. And then farther down was where the mother, Eliza, was. So Velma was found the next morning after, Hooper couldn't rescue her. And then the mother was found also that same morning, just a couple hours later. But she was alive. She had managed to hold on all night. She again, just like Hooper, was tossed out, basically got stuck in a bush. She had sand and mud up to her knees. She was trying to climb out, but she eventually got found. And here is an exact quote directly from her. So this is her talking about trying to get to her uncle's house, which was just nearby. There seemed nothing to do but return to the drift and sit there through the weary night, hoping that someone would see and help me. All night I sat there praying to God to keep me safe until someone arrived to help me get out of my terrifying predicament and aid me in reaching a place of safety. She also said that I had to struggle continually to death. I pushed away the floating debris with all the power at my command. Basically, she had to struggle for her life. She fought and fought and fought against the raging current. And when she was found the next morning, she had spent the entire night out in the cold. Now it was August. So August in Boone isn't, hot like it is in the rest of the South, but it definitely wasn't cold. But out there, basically wet, windy, you never know if it's still going to keep raining, right? It could not have been fun at all. And then the last member of the family I haven't talked about, and also the youngest, was BL. So he was basically cuddled up with his dad Andrew that night earlier. He fell asleep, and he's 7 years old. So they basically took him and then they bring him upstairs and put him to bed. He did not know anything about the flooding. He didn't know anything was happening. He basically, when they interviewed him and they were talking to him, they asked, "How do you know what happened for you to get outside of the house?" And he said no, right? So basically, once the house started moving, started turning and everything, his body was flung from the house and ended up in a drift on the side of the stream. And he basically doesn't remember how any of that happens. He just woke up the next morning, or well, he probably woke up that night, and he saw the drift, and that he had no idea. And he basically, you know, had barely any scratches on him. And the fact that that happened when he was completely unconscious, a lot of people believed, you know, it's a sign from God that like this little child was just saved, basically. Andrew and his 3 daughters that passed were all buried on August 16th, 1940. The only member of their family that was present was Earl, because again, he wasn't home. He had managed to get back then the next couple days, wading through all of the rubble. His mom, his 2 brothers, they were both in the hospital. And his mom said that she was, you know, completely heartbroken and everything, that she couldn't go to the funeral because they were treating her for her injuries. I just want to say that I am incredibly grateful to Ivy Greene for writing this book. Again, this was her family. She wrote it in 1941, just a year after these events happened. I know how hard that would be, especially back then when, you know, documenting your life that publicly is just really hard to do. When I found that book in the library, I was, you know, completely astonished. 1, at what happened, but 2, at the fact that I have a full firsthand account of the history, basically 80 years ago. And with all that happened with Hurricane Helene, we kept talking and talking about that history. So it was so exciting for me to be able to learn it, and it was so devastating to really understand the horrors that her family went through. Now, before I get to Helene, it's obvious that, you know, flooding is going to always happen in mountain communities. Basically, any rain will cause problems if proper irrigation and proper precautions aren't met. And there's a certain standard where just too much rain is too much, and there's really nothing you can do about it. Helene was the, you know, #1 example. No amount of irrigation, no amount of city planning could have prevented the flooding from Helene. The 2 biggest modern day floods besides Hurricane Helene were in 1989 with Hurricane Hugo, and then in 2017 on October 23rd. And this was, from what I found, it was just general rain and stuff because there were no hurricanes in North Carolina that happened in October of that year. But again, both of those floods pale in comparison to Hurricane Helene, but they, again, both caused a lot of damage. They caused a lot of people to lose power, caused some deaths, not as much as Helene, and they, you know, are examples of the problem that the Western North Carolina and the mountain communities have had. And now we arrive at Hurricane Helene. So basically, 250 people nationwide died because of this hurricane. However, in Watauga County, it was only 2 people. And we're incredibly lucky that that is the case. However, the damage done from this disaster was astronomical. However, a lot of North Carolina was not as lucky. Buncombe County, which is where Asheville is, suffered 23 casualties and a lot more damage, right? The campus of UNC Asheville was out for basically an entire month of school, when here at App State, we were only out for about 2 to 3 weeks, which is, you know, really bad, but it's not as bad as Asheville had it. But again, here at the modern day, I believe that Helene is going to be one of the worst floods that this region will experience. Hopefully for the next 60 to 80 years. I don't want something like this to happen again, but you never know. The last thing that I'll mention is, again, the feeling of the lost province that these counties in the western part of the state are feeling. Watauga County and, you know, Ashe County, Avery County, Buncombe County, they all feel like they have been gypped by the federal and the state government, right? They feel that, you know, we need relief effort. And North Carolina, the Governor Stein and the legislature, they have done a lot, right? They have done a lot to help, right? Attorney General Jeff Jackson is doing a lot to make sure companies aren't scamming people who are rebuilding. However, FEMA has basically become incompatible to actually doing their job, right? If FEMA doesn't have the proper money and the proper funds, then we cannot fix our communities. And I understand that that is a whole national political debate, and I'm not trying to spark that right now, right? But the issue that specifically is here in this video is that Watauga County suffers floods, right? We don't suffer floods every year, right? We don't usually do it every 10 years, right? But when we do, we need to rebuild. And right now, we and the rest of Western North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, right, parts of Georgia, we need money from the state governments and from the federal government to rebuild. And if we do not properly get that money, then that is not a good look for the government, for citizens, for really anything. And this will just farther and farther invigorate the whole mentality of the lost province, is that when a disaster happens to us, the government is not here to help us. All right. Now, I necessarily don't believe that is true, right? We've seen, to the contrary, but especially in terms of the federal government, that's kind of where it's going. As these videos get more and more into the modern day issues, I am not shy to talk about the world how it is. Helene and disaster recovery and FEMA has all become a national debate and an issue, and I really hate that that is the case. And Watauga County and a lot of these other places need money to rebuild, right? But I also understand the sentiment, especially nationally, of why would we put money into these places if they're just going to continuously get destroyed? And I don't know how this is going to play out. I pray and hope that Watauga County can rebuild, that Asheville and Kentucky and Georgia and Tennessee can all rebuild, right? But I don't know. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. I know that I got really in-depth into disaster relief, but that's just kind of how it is. It's very, very interesting to actually read about histories and read about people talking about their disasters all the way back in 1940. And we now have to deal with the same issues. And me here today talking about Hurricane Helene is basically in 80 years going to feel the same way to them. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. And as always, I hope you have a great day.